China. Is a trade war ahead with the United States? How soccer and some Somali immigrants transformed a town in Maine. Plenty of bad news around the world, but lots of positive news as well. We'll tell you about it. These segments and more. And it's all right here, right now, from the Global Lane. North Korea's Kim Jongun has traveled outside of his country for the first time since inheriting power in 2011. He made the trip by train to China, where he met with Chinese President Xi Jinping. The two leaders likely discussed economic sanctions against the Kim regime and upcoming talks with President Trump. Well, joining us with some insights is Dr. Carl Minzner. He's an expert in Chinese law and governance and professor of law at Fordham University. He's also the author of a new book called End of an Era: How China's Authoritarian Revival is Undermining Its Rise. Xi Jinping met with Yoon. He was one of the most Googled names recently, Xi was. So what's he up to?
Well, certainly, I think Kim is certainly interested in making sure that his relations with China are solid in advance of the upcoming potential meeting with Trump. So I think that's what's on Kim's mind. For Xi, he's also very interested in trying to understand what's going on with Kim, worried about instability on his northeast frontier.
Yeah, he seems like he's very concerned about that. I think he said at one time, you're causing instability here for China and the whole region. So what do you think they were discussing?
Well, I certainly think Xi wants to know what Kim is planning to do with respect to nuclear proliferation issues. And as you highlighted, I think one of Xi's top concerns is implications on his border that might impact domestic stability inside China itself, which is Xi Jinping's top priority.
Trump administration is in talks with China about tighter tariffs on products imported into the U.S. by that country. And some say we could be heading for a trade war that may prove devastating to the global economy. What do you think?
Well, I certainly think Trump is pivoting away from decades of U.S. commitment towards multilateral organizations and free trade policies. And the tariffs that were announced relatively suddenly do seem to be a decision primarily of his own making. And so it's introduced a significant element of uncertainty going forward in U.S.-China relations. Chinese have already announced some prospective counter tariffs, and they've held out the possibility that they might have more aggressive measures, such as on soybeans, if this should blow up into a full-scale battle between the two countries over trade.
Yes, it always seems like they respond to these things with sanctions or basically tariffs, I guess, against American agricultural products. Now, China recently also held military drills in the South China Sea, and President Xi reportedly vowed to wage a bloody battle for world domination. So what do you think that was all about?
Well, some of that is just rhetoric, but the Chinese authorities have been sending signals, particularly to neighbors in the Southeast Asia, that they're very tight on their territorial claims in the South China Sea. So some of those moves are directed at Vietnam, at Philippines, and neighboring countries to tell them back off. We're serious about maintaining our territorial claims.
Well, how should the U.S. respond? Should we just ignore that?
The United States has responded with these freedom of navigation operations around some of the Chinese islands, claimed islands, and sort of created islands that have been created from the ocean, to demonstrate that the United States adheres to principles of freedom of navigation. And in fact, I believe the French also have now, and perhaps all of the Australians as well, have also stepped in to say this is also a principle that we have an interest in upholding as well.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens with that at a time when we're relying on China to help negotiate the deal with North Korea. They've got a lot of problems of their own, have they not?
They do have many deep problems economically and politically. China's domestic politics are entering a crucial era. I mean, you are now seeing the end of China's reform era. What we thought were Chinese politics from starting in 1978, this period that we think of the reform era, was marked by rapid economic growth, a certain degree of ideological openness to the outside, and relative political stability. China, which was a one-man state under Mao, essentially has now, in the 80s and 90s, became a one-party state, really where collective leadership was the norm. And what we've seen in the last 2 or 3 weeks is that's eroding. You're now seeing China begin to swing back towards a more personalized authoritarian regime that, in my view, is a lot less stable.
And what do you think that means for the future then inside China?
I worry that those risks of instability that you might start to see as those political norms that had built up in the 80s and 90s begin to erode. Some of the instability that existed in the 1960s and 70s comes back, where leadership decisions begin to reflect the will of an individual, where purges of people who fall on the wrong side of the top leader perhaps become more common. And so I really worry about what this means. I think in the short term, it's a more hardline authoritarian regime. In the longer term, I think it's potentially a more unstable one.
So maybe another cultural revolution?
Not in the short term, but you're starting to think along the lines that I'm worried about, and that has real implications for domestic politics in China.
And I think for our viewers, it would mean real implications for the Christian population there.
Absolutely.
As we've seen crackdowns and so forth.
I think state controls on religion are likely to be ramped up. I think you are entering an era. The 1970s and 80s saw the party back a little bit out of this realm of trying to govern people's personal lives. Religious belief, you had more flexibility to do what you wanted in private as long as you didn't try to organize publicly. And one of the things that's happening right now is Chinese leaders are really starting to take a much tighter look at religions, particularly the ones they regard as foreign. There's this very intense interest in Islam and some really draconian controls that have descended across Western China. And I think it's an open question as to whether some of those controls start to move into and or begin to be used against the Christian community as well. You've seen some suggestion of that in one particular eastern province, and it's probably a good idea to watch out to see whether that starts to spread more widely in China.
As Americans talk of border walls and debate DACA and the appropriate response to illegal immigration, one town in Maine is sharing its story of transformation. Several years ago, residents of Lewiston resisted the settlement of Somali refugees into their town. The mayor even wrote letters to federal officials urging them to stop the migration. But the Somali immigrants were determined to win the hearts and minds of the locals. Their story is told in the book, One Goal, a Coach, a Team, and the Game That Brought a Divided Town Together. The author Amy Bass joins us now with more. Amy, thanks for joining us today. So why did you choose that title for your book?
Well, I think it's a play on words, obviously, that they have one goal in terms of their futures. They have one goal in terms of winning a state championship soccer game, and they win by one goal.
When did the refugees first come to Lewiston, and why did the townspeople react negatively?
We're looking at one of the fastest, if not the fastest, migrations into a town of this size in modern American history.
So tell us a little bit about this. Is it a small town, and how many Somalis were we talking about?
So Lewiston is a city of about 36,000 people. It's a mill town. It was a thriving manufacturing center in Maine, as many New England cities on rivers were. And the bottom fell out of manufacturing. So like those other New England cities, there was an enormous economic downturn. This created a big vacancy that Somali migrants started to seek and fill. Lewiston had a vacancy rate. So over the course of a decade or so, between 6,000 and 7,000 African immigrants arrived in Lewiston.
Wow. And I mean, what were the people afraid of? Were they afraid of them taking jobs, them just not knowing their culture, or what?
I think that there's all of that. I think there's a culture shift. I think there was a enormous racial shift in terms of the city's demographics, language, food. Yes, there is always that fear that someone is getting something that you're not. And learning how to be a community is hard work. It doesn't just naturally happen.
Well, I understand the Somalis were determined to make it work. How did they bring unity to Lewiston?
They're determined to make it work because, these are families that had to flee their country in a time of civil war and drought and famine. They lived and raised some of their children in the refugee camps in Kenya. And so keeping their family together and finding a safe place where things like education and work could be emphasized was the top priority system. So you have a determination of survival, and you have a determination of family, and you have a determination to belong somewhere.
What should they know about the difference between refugees and illegal immigrants? There's a difference.
Yes, refugees are they come through a federal system from the Commission of regarding refugees that the United Nations runs. The vetting process, which I outline in the book, is incredibly complex. What these families go through to get through this system and to another place, a safe place, it really has nothing to do with illegal immigration. This isn't the DACA question. This isn't an illegal immigration question. These folks have refugee status, and when they get here, lots of them, go through naturalization process. They're raising their kids here. Their kids are being born here. They're attending school. They're finding jobs, and they're making a home and a community for themselves.
Yeah, there's really a problem there because many Americans kind of mix it all together, and they're two separate issues. So tell me, how did this heart change come about? Was it a gradual change? What brought it about?
I think it's always a work in progress. I don't think it's ever anything to be thinking is settled, because, again, I do think that there's always steps forward and steps back. There were some painful moments that Lewiston went through, some incidents, some hate incidents that they rallied around to bring the community together, to find ways to be healing, to come to understandings. And for my book, in one goal, I used the window of soccer and this incredible transformation that takes place in the high school soccer team, with Somalis finding their way onto the varsity roster, community members working hard, the Somali community, the mentors of the Somali community, working with the high school coach, Mike McGraw, and producing this undefeated championship team, the first one in Lewiston history, in which thousands of people attend a state championship game and really come together.
So community pride through sports.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, it sounds like a fascinating story about heart change. The book, again, is One Goal, a coach, a team, and the game that brought a divided town together. Amy Bass, thank you so much for joining us today. Washington politics and investigations, Russian aggression, North Korean missiles and nukes, wars, refugees, climate change, illegal immigration, mass shootings, #MeToo. If we watch the news long enough, we may start feeling that the future is hopeless. But some of us still believe our best days are yet to come. From an economic and humanitarian standpoint, some nations are thriving more than ever. Joining us now to set it straight is Greg Easterbrook. He's author of a new book called It's Better Than It Looks: Reasons for Optimism in an Age of Fear. Greg, thank you for joining us today. So with everything that's going on in Washington and around the world, how can anyone still be positive? Are you giving us false hope?
Hope not. But the fact that there are individual bad events, many of them all around our world, shouldn't obscure our knowledge of the larger arcs that are almost all positive. And everything that we can measure objectively, not your subjective feelings about the world, but the objective trends that are in play. News has been positive for years, if not for decades. All forms of pollution except for greenhouse gases, that's a big exception, but except for greenhouse gases, all forms of pollution are in long-term decline. Despite the horror of school shootings, violent crime is in long-term decline. War, despite what you see on cable news, is in long-term decline, while education levels are rising, longevity is increasing, almost all forms of disease, including rates of cancer, are declining, discrimination's declining, freedom is increasing. By just about everything that can be measured that's objective, life in the United States and Western Europe and in many other parts of the world gets steadily better.
And on a grand scale, Greg, how long will this type of positivity last? How about other nations?
There's a lot to fear about the future, but the positive trends that we live in, not just in the United States and European Union, but especially actually a lot of the great progress in our world is happening in Asia and Africa. Those trends are at least decades long. Most of them date from the end of World War II, not every one of them, but most of them do. We're in our second to third generation of, in most of the world, not for everybody, but in most places, positive trends in most subject categories.
Okay, well, let's look at a few of these from your book. I know you list many positive changes and promising results like sanitation, transportation, education. Explain for us, do you have some more examples?
Sure. Well, health is a key one that we tend to overlook because we take modern healthcare for granted. Since the late 19th century, almost everywhere in the world, longevity has been rising with each passing generation. In fact, it's close to spooky. Every decade, about 3 months is added to the projected lifespan of new children that are being born. Right now, at the beginning of here's an example for the United States. At the beginning of the 20th century, average lifespan of the United States was 46 years. At the beginning of the 21st century, average lifespan in the United States was 74 years. We're on track now to have an average lifespan at the beginning of the 22nd century of almost 100 years. And all this has happened despite, these numbers include the horrors of World War II, they include the AIDS epidemic and many other public health emergencies. And they expand, not exactly the same numbers I just gave you, but for most of the rest of the world, including very troubled countries, including Afghanistan, life expectancy steadily grows longer.
How about education? Are we seeing a more educated populace around the world?
Yes, education levels keep rising. The United States, now 29% of its citizens hold some kind of college degree, either 2-year, 4-year, or master's degree. That's the highest it's ever been in the United States. It's one of the highest numbers in world history. There's a few countries that are even better. South Korea, something like 35% of its citizens hold a college degree. And in that case, many of them are postgraduate degrees, master's degrees, and above. More important for the whole of the human family, which is now, hard to believe, keep this in mind, 7 billion souls in the human family, is that in the last 2 generations, dramatic increase in ability to read and write. 15% of members of the human family could read and write at the end of World War II. Now it's 85%, and it's well on its way to 90%. And really dramatic increase in education for girls and young women, who in many countries, as recently as a generation ago, received little, if any, education outside the home, and now in almost all countries receive at least an elementary education and are on their way to receiving the equivalent of high school educations as well.
Despite all the good news that you shared, how about the challenges that we're still facing today? And do you have any feasible suggestions to tackle these matters?
Yes, I devoted an entire chapter, and It's Better Than It Looks, to the practical things that can be done about climate change, not to blue sky crazy ideas, but practical ideas. And the key point that I make in this chapter is that greenhouse gas emissions are fundamentally an air pollution problem. And the 2 previous big air pollution problems, smog and acid rain, were both corrected much faster and much more cheaply than anyone expected. I think the same thing can be done with greenhouse gases, and I spell out a reform agenda, and It's Better Than It Looks. Inequality, I have a chapter on that. I think that's a tougher nut to crack. I think there will probably never be a human society that's not unequal in some way, because we're all born with different abilities and talents. But I think we can fix the financial side of inequality so that people who didn't attend a college, and today right now about 40% of people who could be in college or could have been in college have had some college time. It'll probably never be 100%. So we have to change society in ways that if you didn't attend college, that in an ever more education-focused society, you can still find an important and satisfactory role. And I think that's actually a harder challenge than fixing climate change, but I think that can be fixed too. And I spell out a reform agenda for it in the book.
Okay, I guess it's just a matter of how you look at it. Is a glass half full or half empty? So Greg Easterbrook, author of a new book called It's Better Than It Looks, Reasons for Optimism in an Age of Fear. Thanks so much for your insights today.
Sure, happy to talk to you.
As a senior international correspondent at CBN News, I've had the opportunity to encounter people from all over the world and right here in America. And many have shared their stories with me. Some of them came to America with nothing, but most have worked hard pursuing the American dream. And Jimmy O. Young was born and raised in Hong Kong, China. He came to America at a young age, and against all odds, he disappointed his Chinese parents by becoming a comedian and cast member of a popular HBO show. He's just written a new book called How to American. Jimmy, thanks so much for being with us today. So how long have you been a comedian, and what did your parents expect you to be?
I've been a comedian for about 10 years now, and now an actor also. And my parents wanted me to go into finance, be a lawyer, something like a real job. And obviously, I failed to do that. I did graduate school with an economics degree, but I guess I never amounted to anything.
You've been living in America for many years. So what things did you choose as the great resources to prepare you for your jokes?
I think a lot of it comes from my parents. Comedy comes from truth, and somewhat it's therapeutic. So when my parents are disappointed and they're sending me, careerbuilder.com emails every day, and my dad is like, Jimmy, you're not that funny. Real people is hiring. And that's kind of what's funny to me. And also just experience growing up, like my first day in America. Didn't even understand what the simplest slangs meant, like what's up. They didn't teach me what's up in Hong Kong, so I just looked up in the sky and I wasn't sure what was going on. So,
what do you think of our current president?
I think the way I wrote the book, it's because there's so much going on, discussions with immigration, and we're making it really into like a, split issue with bipartisan and a political issue. And the reason I want to write the book is to kind of humanize it, right? Without kind of choosing a side and arguing with the other side. I want to just share my point of view from a first-person point of view and educate these people, anyone, really maybe that hasn't had a lot of experiences around immigrants, and seeing our journey, seeing my journey, seeing my story. Hopefully that will give them a more informed opinion on what it's like to be an immigrant.
Are we a little too serious?
I do. I do think everybody take things a little too seriously, and there's always a fine line before you say something that offends someone, which is hard for comedians now, because we're used to being the one that says and points out everything. So I think it's important to always be humorous, be entertaining outside of this, to give people, if anything, a distraction and an escape.
There's still many great things about America, wouldn't you agree? Share some with us.
Absolutely. I mean, this is still one of the most tolerant countries when it comes to ethnicities, one of the most understanding countries. When I went to Italy, I studied abroad there, I just walked by the street vendors, and everybody would just scream out different, Asian greetings to get my attention, like konnichiwa, kamsahamnida, ni hao. And I'm like, sir, how are you doing? I'm speaking perfect English to them, and they'll still repeat themselves, like, oh, konnichiwa. I'm like, I'm not even Japanese, man. And they don't get it. They're not as politically correct as we are. At least, maybe some people aren't here, but at least we try. At least there's an awareness. And also, really, at the end of the day, this is still where the American dream come true, where it's a country where I could be an immigrant that became a comedian that's on television now. I don't think I could do that in any other country.
And Jimmy, what do you want people to get from your book?
Well, I want to be relatable, to people that has immigrants that's going through the assimilation process, or has went through this assimilation process, or for anyone that grew up maybe with difficult parents that did something that against their parents' will to be who they are now. And also, I want people to just form an honest opinion by seeing my honest story of a first-person point of view of an immigrant journey in a humorous way, in a fun read. I'm not trying to force anything down your throat, but hopefully, through this fun, funny story, that people will be more understanding of what it feels like to be an immigrant assimilating into America.
Well, we sure could use some fun reads of late. Jimmy O. Young, author of a new book called How to American. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much.
The Easter Bunny visited the White House this week, but it was President Trump who was hopping mad about DACA and immigration. As a caravan of 1,500 Hondurans wheeled through Mexico to the U.S. border, Mr. Trump urged Mexico to prevent them from crossing into the USA. And at the annual Easter egg roll, the president placed blame on Democrats in Congress for preventing an agreement on DACA. That's the government's deferred deportation program. It's for 700,000 children of illegal immigrants who arrived here prior to June 2007.
The Democrats have really let them down. They've really let them down. They had this great opportunity. The Democrats have really let them down. It's a shame. And now people are taking advantage of DACA, and that's a shame.
The president wanted a deal. He'd allow the DACA immigrants to stay in exchange for $25 billion in border wall funding. Congress only approved $1.5 billion. Also this week, the Justice Department announced new immigration case quotas to help speed up deportation decisions. Immigration judges must now clear 700 cases per year. In one case this week, a San Francisco judge freed illegal immigrant prisoner Fernando Carrillo. ICE officials arrested him last October for drunk driving. The judge said Carrillo should not be deported to Mexico because it's unsafe for him to return there. Unsafe for him to return there? How safe was it for San Jose motorists when intoxicated Carrillo got behind the wheel of a car? How safe will they be if he repeats his behavior? Here's what Carrillo said about ICE agents when he was released from federal custody.
They don't care. They just do whatever, they've been told to do, and they don't have the human side. They don't think about the consequences in the families.
Excuse me, Mr. Carrillo. They don't care about the consequences and the families. I think they care about U.S. citizens and their families and doing their job to enforce the law. Mr. Carrillo, how much did you show that you cared for your 5-year-old daughter and the families of other motorists when you drove drunk? And here's what Carrillo's wife said.
I'm looking forward to shedding light on what is going on in our community. I think Fernando's firsthand experience is the only experience that we can use to make change in our communities.
Ms. Barraza, the only change many American citizens want is to see for your husband to either get a good immigration attorney and make his stay here in the United States legal, or go back to Mexico. That's it. If he is sent back, then you and your family can join him. Well, we have a legal process here in the United States. You cannot come in unchecked and uninvited. I've said this before. It's like when someone knocks on the door of your home. You don't just let anyone in. You want to make sure they mean you no harm and won't trash your house, right? Well, why should those who come here illegally be allowed to stay? They are lawbreakers, criminals. They have violated our immigration laws. And those who give them safe haven are their accomplices. They, too, should be thrown in jail for not upholding our laws. And that includes politicians like the mayor of Oakland, California, who recklessly endangered the lives of federal agents recently when she warned illegals that ICE officers were coming to arrest them. When he was freed, Fernando Carrillo said, God gave him another chance. Yes, he did, Mr. Carrillo. And we pray that you truly follow him and turn your life around. We also pray that our government leaders will discern when they should show mercy for children, like those who came here illegally with their parents, and when to deport people who pose a threat to our society. Yes, we need to show mercy, but Christ also expects us to obey the laws of our government, in this case, immigration laws. Well, that's it from the Global Lane this week. Follow us on Facebook, iTunes, SoundCloud, YouTube, and Twitter. And until next time, be blessed.